Freedom is the crime that contains all crimes. We have many friends in prison. We ourselves have been among the fucked jailbirds. This is why we have felt the wave of revolt which began on Sunday, May 5th, with the mutiny on a part of a fleuret-mérogis coming for some time. Prisoners who could no longer tolerate the crap to which prison guards more and more openly dedicate themselves. Two specific events were probably too much. In March, the murder of Bruno Sulac by guards after a failed escape. The liars that talk on television and write in the newspapers have presented it as an accident, despite the fact that a few guards in Fleuret have bragged about killing him. At the beginning of April, a guard was punched during an escape attempt at a prison in Lyon. His colleagues responded by proclaiming a strike. A few days later, still in Lyon, some prisoners reacted to this arrogance by beating two of these shits. A national strike of all prison guards followed this. It further aggravated the unbearable conditions by eliminating the hour of air, visits, and leaves, multiplying the discomforts, daily vexations, and beatings that were already part of ordinary administration. Those who speak to us of overcrowding the prisons are the very ones who have filled them until they burst. Obviously, they are turning the question upside down. For us, it is not a question of building more prisons, but of emptying those that already exist. The need of prisoners in revolt is obvious. Freedom! They don't negotiate this with the prison administration, but rather start to take it for themselves. Climbing up on the roof is freedom snatched from the state. Let's take air, they exclaim. For a few hours they can chat, protected from indiscreet ears, dialogue with their comrades outside over the walls, insult and throw roof tiles at the dirty skunks who oppress them, and finally talk about themselves. Here they are, the real free conversations. The prison administration and the media attribute the revolt of Fleuret-Mérogis to a handful of political militants, specifically of Action Directe, who, preoccupied with their notoriety, have always participated in this lie, not stopping these statements. All these liars had already done the same thing during the hunger strike proclaimed in Fleuret at the end of 1984. Let's abandon the militants to their lying wooden language. But there has been real solidarity among prisoners. At Bois d'Arcy, prisoners in the cells were ready to wreck everything if those on the roof were evicted. This is why the GIGN did not intervene, and the others were able to remain in the open air for about 40 hours, fed by their comrades in confinement. Meanwhile, in Bastia, a hunger strike was announced in solidarity with the rebels of other prisons. There's a footnote here that I'll read now. Groupe d'Intervention à la Gendarmerie Nationale was an autonomous special division used in riots, seizures, and is subordinate to the ministry. Returning to the text. The same solidarity has been expressed outside as well. On May 19, in Montpellier, a group of people lined up on the side of the prisoners in revolt and attacked the cops from behind. The cops dispensed them by unleashing dogs on them. The main concern of the prisoners has been that of communicating with the outside, shouting their protests against imprisonment, the daily terror that is exercised against them. They want to kill us. They gas us. They cudgel us. These are things that could be read on the banners at Bois d'Arcy. Prisoners take an enormous risk when they rebel. Everyone knows beforehand that the prison administration will immediately make them pay dearly for this, with custodial sentences, the suppression of sentence reductions, transferals, beatings, murders disguised as suicides. In Douai, 3 prisoners, one of whom was supposed to be released in June, had climbed onto the roof and demonstrated their rebellion by throwing down roof tiles. As soon as they came down, an emergency tribunal condemned them to 15 months and 6 months additional time without parole. This sentence was intended to be exemplary. There's another footnote here that I'll read. Another clever con. Sentence reductions are actually increases in the sentences of those who stand up for themselves. Judges calculate sentences in terms of potential concessions. If they want a prisoner locked up for 9 months, they sentence him to a year. The anxiety engendered by repressive terror and the despair of returning to the oppressive isolation of the prison are so present even in the moment of rebellion that some of the prisoners turned against themselves, mutilating themselves. In Fleury and Montpellier, some prisoners took possession of some barbiturates and gulped them down, smashing everything in their path. 25 of them were seriously poisoned. Others slashed their wrists, calling on their comrades to do likewise. One of them died. Meanwhile, several prisoners in different yards hanged themselves. At this moment, in St. Paul and Lyon, some prisoners try to mutilate or hang themselves every day. Freedom is the crime that contains all crimes, and it is against this crime that the old world defends itself. The state is physically eliminating all the beautiful young people who aren't resigned, the same young people who die, murdered by cops or reactionary pro-cop vigilantes. The state buries those that the law can trap alive in its prisons as long as possible, while terrorizing those who manage to stay outside. For these, it pays educators and other pests to demoralize them and make them forget their comrades in jail. Poor neighborhoods on the outskirts are emptied of their youth while prisons fill up. This is the secret of overcrowding. The state's lackeys would like us to believe that it is a budgeting problem. Overcrowding is supposed to be caused by a malfunctioning of the prison system, but it is actually a result of the optimal functioning of the judicial system. There's a footnote here. In the big cities of France, poor neighborhoods tend to be comprised of horrendous projects built in the suburban outskirts of the cities, in an attempt to make the poor invisible in the city centers. Returning to the text. Obviously, the only way to deal with overcrowding in prisons is to empty them, as the rioters in Fleury maintained. On this point, they couldn't have been clearer. In a declaration signed by the 600 leaders, they opposed the building of new prisons. On the other hand, the prisoners in Montpellier furnished a concrete solution to overcrowding. They destroyed almost all of the cells. The prisoners are rebelling against the justice system and, more specifically, against the kidnapping that is portrayed as preventative detention, which officially condemns people to an indefinite confinement that is later confirmed if not increased at the trial. Moreover, we are reminded of the movement that sent collective demands for provisional liberty in Lyon at the beginning of summer in 1984. Footnote. Since in France, the judges who receive demands for provisional liberty from prisoners awaiting trial must respond in 5 days in order to prevent the prisoner from being released, a collective action of this sort can clog up the system, leading to the release of some of the prisoners. However, in this instance, the judges got together to guarantee that didn't happen. Returning to the text. As long as there have been prisons, everything prisoners have gotten they conquered by risking their lives in revolt. In some instances, they were able to impose a breach in the prison regime. What prisoners managed to grab by force and at the cost of blood, the prison administration later gnaws away again, using improvements of prison conditions as a means of blackmail. The guards have the task of persecuting the least bit of freedom in every gesture of daily life. The deprivation of freedom is refined every day in the constant, sadistic abuse of these pigs. In prison, freedom is even the choice to remain seated, asleep, or standing when one wants to. Since the time, Eberhardt and Badinter, if the state proposes a program of reform, it is solely to prevent the risk of an explosion, and certainly not for humanitarian reasons. Footnote. Those were two former French ministers of justice. Prisoners no longer demand reform. They have suffered its reality. The application of each reform depends on the goodwill of the prison administration and the guards. What was presented as a benefit becomes a further degradation. Quote-unquote free conversations are even refused by some, because what one has to submit to in order to get these visits is so humiliating. Though in appearance the death penalty has been abolished and no longer is part of the legal code, it has in fact become more common and democratized. It is now carried out by a mob of reactionary vigilantes and cops, while in prisons, the guards do it. In the same way, the suppression of the QHS, maximum security wings, was a humanitarian bluff, supported by the left. The best example of this opportunistic attitude was when they used a humanitarian campaign to release Noble Pies, who had denounced the horrors of the QHS, and then, when they were done using him, did not hesitate to lock him back up. Footnote. Special attention should be given to the unbearable situation of condemned prisoners who have been locked up in solitary confinement are those like noble pieds, who are still there, those who the prison administration particularly harasses in order to make them pay a high price for never having submitted to the prison regime. We cite the cause of Charlie Bauer, sentenced to 20 years inside 1962 for burglary. He was released on parole in 1976 after long experience in the QHS. He was imprisoned again with a 5-year sentence for receipt of stolen goods, with an additional 6 years for breaking parole. He probably won't be able to leave until 1990. Bauer fought against the QHS, where he met Jacques Mazarin, a well-known French bank robber, who the authorities couldn't manage to keep locked up. In his later days, he explicitly fought against the state and the prison system. Since they couldn't keep him caged, the French authorities shot him down. Translator's note. This was something the prison administration couldn't forgive. As a special regime of isolation, the QHS was never suppressed. They simply changed the name. It is now called QI, Isolation Quarters. In 1983, a new prison called Les Gaulettes opened near Nevers. It is intended for imprisoning convicts who are considered particularly dangerous. It can hold 80 prisoners in an extremely harsh surveillance regime. Furthermore, the administration and the guards want to extend QHS conditions to the entirety of the prison. The number of isolation cells has increased. The DPS, specifically watched prisoner, statute is applied more and more. Punishment cells are increasingly filled. With greater frequency, the prison administration reserves the right to inflict more special punishments and sanctions on the basis of the tension that reigns in prison. Abuse and beatings are the order of the day. It drives prisoners to suicide or allows murder to pass for suicide. There are no natural deaths in prison. Those who succumb die of prison. Murder is called accidental death. Like Mohamed Rabi in Rouen and Bruno Sulac in Fleury, who guards killed during an escape attempt. Like Alain Pinot in Fresnes, killed by the cops. Prisoners' suicides are all murders, committed by the prison administration that gladly provides you with the rope for hanging yourself. And if there are more and more suicides, at least 20 since the beginning of the year, it means that living conditions inside are increasingly intolerable. An additional pressure is exercised against condemned immigrants. Along with prison, they can suffer a second penalty, deportation. And it even goes so far that, after having served their sentence, they continue to rot in prison for months before the deportation procedures are completed. To finish with Badinter's famous reforms, his latest gift, the TIF, a work program mentioned above, has been a fine load of shit. One can already predict that new accused prisoners awaiting trial will quickly fill the cells emptied by the TIG. This modern version of forced labor is not at all preferable to prison. So little so that some of those convicted have refused it. All those who demand rights in prison, prisoners' unions, are far behind the prisoners' movement of revolt, because prisoners can only impose their demands through violence, risking their own lives. Union battles will be carried out within the law and through the law, by prosecuting all abuses before the qualified authorities. This is the program of prisoners' unions. We have already seen what unions are on the outside. They only serve to channel and domesticate people's rebellion in reforms aimed at prettifying misery. Furthermore, they are used to stifle the real demands that the poor spontaneously think up in their struggle. Prisoners no longer fight for reforms that they now know were mere illusions. Rather than placing themselves on the abstract terrain of rights, they can demand something that will at least have a concrete result: a general reduction of punishments. It is a question of demanding a reduction of punishments for all those convicted, the release of all prisoners awaiting trial, the definitive stopping of all deportation measures, and, of course, the cancellation of all sanctions against the rebels. The demand for the release of those awaiting trial is more than a specific demand relating to prison. It is not so much addressed to the state or the prison administration as to all the poor for whom preventative detention is a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads every day. It is a challenge launched against the society that resounds in the minds of all those who have decided not to submit. Judicial and prison questions almost always remain private matters in which each one is powerless in his isolation. Both the one on the inside, awaiting her trial, and the one outside, who has a friend in prison and can often do nothing more than help out financially or pay her a visit. The rebels have put forth some practical demands that aim, at the minimum, at getting the greatest number of people out. These demands form a prisoner's offensive against their isolation and an appeal to those on the outside to act concretely to break it. It's a question of bringing pressure to bear against this society, of shitting on this world with its prisons that would prefer not to hear about them. Os Cangaceiros, beginning of June, 1985.
Permet en vérité un mécanisme comme un autre qui m'évite de basculer. La brèche est infime et s'il y a plus de place sur les cimes.